So in the ancient world, when kings or emperors wanted to get a message out throughout their kingdom, they would have to send a messenger. Sometimes those messengers are specifically called heralds or royal herald. See, nowadays, you could do it via like the internet. You could just put it out there. You could broadcast a speech over TV or radio. But before the advent of all that technology, you would literally have to send someone and say, I need you to go from town to town and to give the people of my kingdom this message. Here's like a medieval depiction of a king giving a message to a messenger. And then that messenger would be expected, okay, now go deliver this. Go tell everybody. And typically in most cultures, these messengers, these royal heralds, would have very specific attire so that when they came to town, you knew who they were. You'd recognize them right away. You'd say, okay, based on this person's attire, they are a royal messenger, and let's hear what they have to say. Now, in the Roman Empire, one of the things they would frequently send messages about was military victory. Because Rome expanded their power through war, through violence, and so they would want people to know, hey, we were at war with these people, we were victorious, so now go send these messengers out to deliver the news of victory to all the towns and villages. And in the Roman Empire, again, you could always tell when these messengers were coming because of their dress. The Roman messengers would have a crown of like kind of leaves and branches, very typical Roman type crown. They would carry a spear, and on the tip of that spear, there would be some shrubs or some leaves that were hanging. They would also be waving palm branches, which were a symbol of victory. And so as soon as you saw one of these messengers, even off in the distance, you knew, hey, this was great. There's news of victory that's coming. And so the messengers would come into the town, they would raise their right hand, they would deliver their news. Here it is. Here's the message of victory. And then the people in the town would respond by offering sacrifices and having feasts to celebrate this good news. Now, the word that was used to describe that good news, the Greek word that's used to describe that is the word gospel. That's actually where we get it from. Gospel's directly translated as good news. And in the Roman world, it referred to, most of the time specifically, this good news of military victory. We tend to think of it as a religious term. Most of us who've probably heard the word gospel, you've heard it in the context of a church or Christianity, or someone said, hey, I'm going to share the gospel. But actually, in its origin, it has nothing to do with religion or Christianity at all. It has to do with delivering these messages of victory. And the cool thing about these messages of victory is these messages of victory, this good news, it was about something that had happened. Something that had happened that the people who were receiving the message, they really didn't have any part in. They were over here. This victory happened somewhere else. So they're telling them, hey, here's what happened. But everybody also understood that because this thing happened, there were massive implications for us. Even though we weren't there, this good news brings us good fortune because now we're safe or we're free or whatever threat this enemy has, because our side was victorious, that changes everything for us. So when the earliest Christians began to talk about Jesus, when they began to talk about the life of Jesus and tell people the significance of the life of Jesus, the word they used to describe it was the word gospel. They said, this is what Jesus is, this is what Jesus means for us, is the story of his life, death, burial, and resurrection is gospel. It is good news. And so you see this word all over the New Testament and in the early church is it's gospel. 1 Corinthians 15 is actually the place that most clearly defines what the early church meant when they said the word gospel. 1 Corinthians is a letter written by the Apostle Paul to the church in Corinth. And in 1 Corinthians 15, what he's going to do is he's going to remind them of the gospel that he already shared with them. He's going to say, listen, I've told you this before, you know this, but I'm now going to remind you. And he's going to say that when I use the word gospel, here's what I mean. So here's what he says, 1 Corinthians 15, verse 1. He says, now, brothers and sisters, I want to remind you of the gospel I preached to you, which you received, on which you have taken your stand. By this gospel you are saved if you hold firmly to the word that I preached to you. Otherwise you have believed in vain. For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance. So Paul says, okay, here's the way that gospel news works. You get gospel news, and one person shares it with another person who shares it with another person. It's like a big game of telephone, which is exactly what happens with good news, right? You hear something, hey, did you hear this? No, I didn't. Oh, well, good. Well, here's the news. Okay, cool. Well, hey, did you hear this? No, I didn't. Well, you pass it on. One person tells another person. One generation tells the next generation. Paul says, what I received, I then passed on to you. And Paul says, because this is first importance. This is what matters the most. This is the foundation. This is the essence of Christianity. When you talk about Christian faith, this is what Christian faith is based on. And now here Paul's going to get to the core elements of gospel. Here's where he's going to define, when I say gospel, this is what I mean. Picking up again in verse 3, "For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins, according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day, according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, and then the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500. So Paul says, okay, so here's the essence when we say gospel. And he mentions these three things. He mentions the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus. These are the core elements when we talk about gospel. Death, burial, and resurrection. And sometimes I think when we read like the New Testament, we kind of tend to look at the people who wrote the New Testament because they lived 2,000 years ago. We kind of tend to think that, well, they're probably not as smart as we are because we have all these advances in science and technology and we know more, so they're a bit more gullible. Maybe they're not as intelligent. And the thing about it is, yes, we know more about science, but people who lived 2,000 years ago are just as intelligent as you and I are. These are not dumb people. And so it's not any easier to believe that someone resurrected 2,000 years ago than it is today. So if you look at someone and be like, hey, my whole life is founded on resurrection, they're like, well, that's weird. You would have got the same look 2,000 years ago. So Paul's very, very well aware of the fact that he tells people, hey, it's about resurrection, that people are going to look at him and go, yeah, I don't buy that. That just doesn't happen. When people die, they stay dead. You don't resurrect. And so Paul does something really sharp here. He goes, listen, I know that resurrection is hard to believe. I know it's easy to doubt. So if you have trouble doubting it, Paul literally lists 500 people. He's like, go ask one of these people. They all watched him die, and then they talked with him. They had breakfast with him. They hung out with him. They literally touched his wounds. So I get that it's hard to believe. It's not easy. I understand that. So if you have trouble, talk to these people and let them tell you their story, because these are the eyewitnesses. So Paul says, this is the foundation of it. This death, this burial, and this resurrection. And twice, Paul uses this phrase, according to the Scriptures. He says all of this happened, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus happened according to the Scriptures, which the Scriptures Paul's referring to is what we know as the Old Testament, or sometimes we call it the Hebrew Bible. It's the Scriptures of ancient Israel. And really, the Old Testament contains the story of Israel and what God begins to do through Israel. And what Paul's saying is that Jesus doesn't just come out of nowhere. That Jesus is actually a part of this thing that God has been up to all along. That what God has been up to since the creation of the world, through Abraham, through Moses, through Ruth, through Esther, through David, through all these people, all of that has led to Jesus. All of that finds its fullness and its culmination in Jesus. And I think this is like really, really powerful for us because we always want things to matter. We want things in our life to be significant. We don't want to go through something, especially something challenging or difficulty, and then just like, it doesn't mean anything. We want it to matter. And so when Paul says all of this happened according to the Scriptures, what he's saying is all of this stuff that came before matters. And all of it's significant. As bizarre as it may seem, as weird as it may seem, as painful as it might have been, as difficult as it might have been, all of it matters because all of it led to Jesus. And ultimately, all of this stuff finds its meaning and its significance in Jesus. Paul says, in Jesus, everything matters. Nothing is wasted. It all comes together in his life, death, and resurrection. And Paul, when he talks about life, death, and resurrection, in this passage right here in 1 Corinthians, he actually doesn't use the name Jesus. He uses Christ. And that's significant because Christ is not a name. Christ is a title. Jesus is his name. Christ is a title that is actually the Greek translation of the Hebrew word Messiah. And in the tradition of ancient Israel, the Messiah was a royal figure. The Messiah was a kingly figure. The Messiah was this one who was going to establish a kingdom and reign over it. And so this is important because what Paul's saying is foundational to the gospel is that Jesus has become the Christ, that he has become the king. That's what his death, burial, and resurrection is about. Jesus doesn't die to appease an angry God, like God's going to strike you down, and so Jesus dies so that God will be happy with you. Jesus dies to overcome death. The Scriptures will talk about how death is this curse and it has this hold over all of creation because everything in creation dies. And once it dies, death keeps that hold on. So death really essentially reigns over creation until Jesus dies and reigns again, or raises again. By doing that, he breaks the hold of death, and now he becomes king. Now he reigns. And so Paul says, this is the gospel. The gospel is that Jesus has become king. He's become the Christ. He's become the Messiah. Through his death, burial, and resurrection, he is king, and he is making everything right. And all of the chaos and the mess and everything that's gone wrong in the world, he's going to make it right because he is the reigning king. Why Jesus says, just before he ascends, which is what kings do, he says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. I am now the reigning king. So when Paul talks about gospel, when the New Testament talks about gospel, this is what they're saying. The gospel is that Jesus has become the Christ, that through his death, burial, and resurrection, he has become the king, and he is setting everything right. He's initiating this new creation. Now, I want you to notice what's missing from Paul's gospel. Me and you. And the reason that I point that out is because my guess is if you've ever had anyone like explain the gospel to you or tell you, like, I'm going to share the gospel with you, more than likely what you've heard is that the gospel is that God loves me, he died for me, and I can be with him forever. Now, those things are all true. Okay? God does love you. He did die for you. You can be with him forever. But what Paul's saying is that's just not the gospel. Because see, what we've done very cleverly is we've taken the gospel in our like kind of individualistic culture and we've made it about us. It's about me. I'm the center of the gospel. The gospel is that God loves me and he did this for me, and it's about what I get from it. And what Paul's saying here is he's saying, no. Those things are true, but that's not the gospel. The gospel is not about me or you at all. The gospel is about Jesus. It's about what he's done and who he has become. Jesus is both the object and the subject of the gospel. The gospel is that God, in the person of Jesus, died, was buried, and resurrected again, and is the king in fulfillment of the scriptures. That all of this story, the story of Israel, finds its fulfillment in Jesus, through whom his death, burial, and resurrection, he has become the Christ, he is the king, he's making everything right. That's the gospel. Now, the gospel does have huge implications for us as people because good news has implications. Good news is the announcement that something happened, but that good news also brings with it good fortune, that it has implications for us. And Paul talks about that. If you go earlier, we read it already, but I'm going to read it again. 1 Corinthians 15, verse 1, Paul talks about the implications. He says, "Now, brothers and sisters, I want to remind you of the gospel I preached to you, which you received and on which you have taken your stand." And here it is. He says, "By this gospel you are saved if you hold firmly to the word I preached to you." Paul says the implication of the gospel for us is because of who Jesus is and what he has done, because he is the reigning king, because he's the Christ, we are being saved. Now, Paul gets that language of saved and salvation. He gets it from Jesus. That Jesus understood that what he was doing was going to result in saving. Luke 19:10, Jesus famously says, it says, "For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." Whenever you come across the word save or salvation anywhere in the New Testament, it always refers to being rescued from a dangerous, life-threatening situation. So my wife and I, in the time that we have been married, we've had 3 dogs. The first dog we got right around the time that we got married, and we sometimes kind of jokingly refer to him as Robo-Dog because he lived to be 20 years old. His name was Murphy. He was a great, great dog. And a couple weeks after Murphy had died, we went and got another dog. And his name's Oliver. We call him Ollie. And we had Ollie for about a year, and then we decided, you know what, every dog should have a friend dog, so let's go get another one. So we went back and got Lucy. So now we have Ollie and Lucy. And all 3 of the dogs we've gotten them from the same place. We've got them from an animal shelter in LA County in the city of Baldwin Park. And the reason we got Murphy from there is at the time we were actually living in LA County, and so that's just kind of where we ended up. But we went back to that shelter to get Ollie and Lucy because we're like, we have such good memories, we got this great dog, they just have the best dogs there. But also because that shelter, and really a lot of LA County animal shelters, are what's known as kill shelters. In Orange County, I don't even think we have kill shelters. But a kill shelter gets its name because at a kill shelter, they will keep a dog for a certain period of time, I think it's like 2 to 3 weeks, And then if no one claims it, if no one adopts it, if no one rescues it, the dog dies. And so I don't know if you've ever been to an animal shelter. Animal shelters are the most depressing place on the planet. Even if you've never been to an animal shelter, several years ago they used to run those commercials with that Sarah McLachlan song. You know, they'd show like these like old dogs and be like, in the arms of the angel. And you're just like, oh my gosh. Like you'd have to go in the other room because it's so depressing. So any animal shelter that you go to is just super depressing. But when you walk through a kill shelter, it's just magnified because you're walking up and down these rows and there's these little prison cells and there's dogs in them. And some of the dogs kind of seem happy and they're kind of running around, but you get a lot of like wounded dogs. You get dogs that are like blind or they're hobbling because they've been on the street or they've been in fights or they've been run over. And every dog is looking at you with this look of desperation because it's life or death for them. Now, I know this probably isn't true, but I have this picture in my mind that like at night, you know, when all the humans are gone, the dogs talk to one another and they know what's happening. All right, like straight out of a Disney movie, like when the guy comes with the hat and the uniform, don't let him take you because they'll kill you. And so you walk up and down these rows and there's all these sad dogs and they just look at you with this look in their eyes that is, save me. Death is imminent. This is my end. If you don't pull me out of here, I'm done. So when we went and got our dog, Lucy, we saw her in the little cage and we kind of knew we wanted her right away, but here's the picture my wife took of Lucy right away. That's her in her little cell at that point. Now again, it's okay. She's alive. She's with us. I hung out with her this morning. She's all good. So we adopted her, rescued her, and she has a good life. But you can just see in these eyes, like these big eyes, this desperation. Like here I am. I'm in jail. Death is imminent. There's nothing I can do about it. I'm done if you don't save me, if you don't rescue me. When the New Testament talks about salvation, this is the picture it's painting. That there is this desperation that we're trapped. There's nothing we can do unless someone else rescues us. Now, we as people, we struggle with the idea of salvation because we don't see ourselves in this kind of situation. We don't think of ourselves as prisoners. We don't see ourselves as like in this desperate situation where death is imminent. Now, most of us, if we look around the world and we look around our lives, we kind of think like, okay, everything's not perfect. Like there's some problems here, but I can fix this. That if I just do the right things, then the right stuff will happen. So if I can just get my life together, if I can get in the right relationship, if I can get the right job, if I can get enough money, if I just do these things, then everything will work out and the outcomes will work out and everything will be okay. So we think that on an individual level. We also think that on a societal level, which this is why we get so passionate about politics. Because politics, we look around, we think, hey, things are going bad. The way we make it right, though, is let's elect the right people and let's pass the right laws. Because if we have the right people and the right laws, then the whole thing will correct itself and everything will be good and the right outcomes will happen. So as much as we may acknowledge, like, yeah, things aren't perfect, we're not here. Right? We're not desperate. We still have this sense of control that we can make this right if we just do the right things, if we just make the right choices. Everything will work out okay. That we have it within us. We are the ones that are in control. Now, human beings have not always thought that way. That hasn't always been our mode of thought. That way of thinking actually comes out of what's known as the Age of Enlightenment, which is this philosophical movement in Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries. And really, the Age of Enlightenment is kind of the culmination of what came before it, like the Renaissance and the Scientific Revolution. And these are these like philosophical movements that happened in the Western world, which when we talk about the Western world, that's like Europe, the United States, even Australia. It's kind of how we transition from like ancient human beings to what we consider like modern humanity. Like, you know, we live these lives of technology and science and reason. And so the Age of Enlightenment is kind of like the pinnacle part of that. That's when we reach that. And the whole thing with the Age of Enlightenment was it was rooted in this idea of human progress. And one of the most significant Age of Enlightenment philosophers and thinkers was a guy named Immanuel Kant. And toward the end of the Age of Enlightenment, in 1784, Immanuel Kant wrote an essay called What is Enlightenment? And he described it, and here's what he said. He said, enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-imposed immaturity. And so what he meant by that is for Kant and for these other Enlightenment thinkers, they looked back on the past and they looked at like death, destruction, war, all of that. And they said the problem is, as human beings, we have allowed ourselves to become prisoners to these other forces, to these other things. And some of the things they talked about were things like religion. Like a lot of things people do, they do because, hey, my religion teaches me to do this, or the gods or goddesses want me to do this, or I have to do this to appease them. So you do all these things in the name of religion. They would also talk about monarchs, kings, queens, emperors. And people would do things because, hey, this is what this leader said, this is what this emperor said. Sometimes they'd even talk about things closer, more intimate personal relationships. Could be a spouse or a parent or some family member. It could even be like things within us like guilt or pride or shame. Whatever it was, there were these forces that kind of controlled the way that humans acted. So we did what we did because we were under the forces of all these other things. And so the whole idea behind the Enlightenment is we need to throw all of these things off. Throw off religion, throw off kings, throw off queens, and when we do that, when we get rid of all these other forces, then all the choices, all the decisions we make will be based on our own reason, our own intellect. And when it's not corrupted by all of this other stuff, then we will create the perfect society. Then we will create the perfect world. Then we'll create paradise. Then we'll create utopia. And so this was the Enlightenment thinking. That's why it's referred to as like the age of reason, the triumph of reason. So they started throwing off all of these other things, and we can do this. We have this within us, that if we're not burdened or shackled by all this stuff, religion, kings, queens, emperors, all that, then our reason will triumph and we will create a better world. So out of the Enlightenment comes all of this progress in thinking, in medicine, in technology. And for the next 150 years in the Western world, that Enlightenment thinking, that progress thinking is what dominates, what drives the entire Western world. Really, Enlightenment thinking is what's behind both the American and the French revolutions. That's why we did what we did. Let's throw these things off. Then we can create this perfect society. But 150 years after the Enlightenment, that way of thinking in Europe collapses. And it collapses because something happens that's so catastrophic that it just blows up that entire mindset. And what happens is World War II. So here's a picture of some of the bombing damage done by World War II. And Europe, you have to remember, Europe was the home of the Age of Enlightenment. That's where it came from. That's where you have all these thinkers that are like, hey, once we throw off this other stuff, we'll leave all this evil and all this other junk behind us, and we will create this paradise. Well, then you get to post-World War II Europe, and it's just rubble. Everything's been bombed out. And so you see in this picture, there's people down there that are beginning to clean up the mess and like, how do we rebuild our continent? And so people are doing that in a physical way, but people are also doing that like in an intellectual, philosophical way. Because they're looking around at what's become of their society and they're thinking to themselves, this wasn't supposed to happen. We believed that when we threw off all this other stuff, when we threw off religion and God and kings and queens and any of this other stuff, that our reason would drive us to make this perfect society. But we ended up in the exact same place. War, death, destruction. And in fact, we created more war, death, destruction than we ever had before. And so on the same continent that gave birth to the Enlightenment, you also have all of these other new ways of thinking that begin to pop up. This is actually, I don't know if you've ever heard the term postmodern. This is where postmodern comes from. And the whole idea behind postmodernism is that, the modern world was supposed to become perfect. The modern world was supposed to be a paradise. It was supposed to be utopia. Well, it wasn't. It's rubble. It was a lie. That whole modern world, it was a lie. So what do we do now? What comes after the triumph of the modern world is postmodernism, which is much more cynical. Another kind of philosophical movement that comes out of this is what's known as deconstruction. A lot of times now you hear about deconstruction as it relates to faith. People that deconstruct their faith, which means you're kind of taking apart, disassembling what it is you believe. Deconstruction, in its origin, has nothing to do with faith or religion. It has to do with this way of seeing the world that came out of the Enlightenment. And it's like, hey, we believed that we could make this perfect society, but this is what we ended up making. Clearly that wasn't true, so we have to deconstruct everything we thought we knew, and where does that leave us? Where do we go from here? Now this stuff, it all happens in Europe first, because this is what Europe looked like after World War II. It takes a while before these ways of thinking actually come to the U.S. because the U.S. didn't have this kind of damage. We lost a lot of soldiers in World War II. Pearl Harbor got bombed, but our country did not look like this. And actually, we experienced a post-war boom in our economy and everything and kind of came back. But then when you get in the decades since, as we see now, everything kind of unraveling, these ways of thinking begin to sink into our country and our culture and our society. And now we find ourselves at this place where, like, literally our world is unraveling. It's in rubble, and we just think, what happened? How did this happen? This is not what was supposed to happen. But what's interesting to me is the Enlightenment way of thinking is so embedded in us that even though we turned our society into rubble with Enlightenment thinking, we still hold on to it. Right? We still think we can figure this out, we can fix it. I mean, just look at technology. Technology's done a lot of really great things. Technology's also done a lot of really destructive things. It's isolated us. It's caused all these, issues, but we keep going with it. We know how destructive it is. We know how harmful it is, but we keep going with it because eventually we'll figure it out. Eventually we'll get there. See, this is where Paul wants us to understand what salvation means. What does it really mean that we are being saved through the gospel? Here's what Paul writes to the church in Rome, Romans 7, verse 21. He says, "So I find this law at work. Although I want to do good, evil is right there with me. For in my inner being, I delight in God's law, but I see another law at work in me, waging war against the law of my mind and making me a prisoner of the law of sin at work within me. What a wretched man I am. Who will rescue me from this body that is subject to death? Thanks be to God who delivers me through Jesus Christ our Lord." See, most of us have convinced ourselves that we're pretty good people. Again, not perfect, but I'm a pretty good person. And so the problem really in our lives, the problem in our world really isn't me, it's you, it's them. You know why work is so stressful and difficult for me? It's not me, it's because I work with idiots. They just don't know what they're doing, they're stupid, they're incompetent, whatever, it's them. You know why the family's a mess? It's not me. I mean, I'm pretty good. It's my boyfriend, it's my girlfriend, it's my spouse, it's my kids. It's my in-laws, it's my parents. Like, they're the problem. You know why society is messed up? It's not me, it's them. And so we take injustice and we take wrongdoing and we take all this stuff and we put it out there. And we say, this is why the world is in shambles. This is why everything is unraveling. This is why everything is rubble. And Paul, this is important, Paul's not going to deny that. Paul's going to say, yes, there is evil out there. Yes, there is injustice out there. Yes, there is lying, cheating, all of that stuff. But Paul also takes that and he turns it in on himself. Because Paul says, here's what I see in my experience. That you look around the world, and yeah, we have this desire to do good, and we have this desire to bring about beauty. But for whatever reason, we inevitably bring destruction. We inevitably bring pain, no matter how hard we try. Paul says, I see that same struggle in myself. That I want to do good, I want to do the right thing, but I end up doing the wrong thing. And what I want to do, I don't do. And what I don't want to do is what I end up doing. Paul says, that same thing that I see all around me that is destroying our world, unraveling our society, leaving our world like in shambles, in rubble. Paul says it also lives in me. See, the world is what it is. Our world is what it is because it's what we've made it. Humans were given that divine vocation in the beginning. God said, here's the world, do something with it. This is what we've done with it. We've created it. And it's not just them that's created it. It's me. Part of the mess of my life is what I have created. And I try to do good. And hear this, because this is important. Paul doesn't have this low view of humanity where he looks at us as humans and says, we're all just a bunch of worms and dirt and garbage. Paul will say, no, as human beings, we're made in the image of God, and we do a lot of really beautiful things. Humanity has done a lot of beautiful things to make the world a better place, to bring about beauty, to bring about joy, to bring about healing and wholeness. And each one of us on an individual level, we have skills and talents and abilities that, man, they make the world a better place. But there's also this other part of us, this part that Paul says is a prisoner. Because as much as we want to do good, we still keep bringing about destruction in our own lives and our own families, and we can't seem to break free from that. What's all around us is also within us. That's why Paul says, what a wretched man I am. It's not just out there. It's in here. Everywhere we go, we can't escape the rubble and the destruction and the despair. And I know what you're thinking. I know what everyone in here is thinking. You're thinking to yourself, this is literally the worst Easter message I have ever heard in my entire life. Like, the only reason I come to church on Easter is to feel good. Like, I know the world's a wreck. I know everything's unraveling. Scott, thank you very much for reminding me of what clearly I already know. I was supposed to feel good, and now I'm just in despair. Because we're talking about all the things we mess up. We're talking about World War II and everything being bombed out, and it's like, this is depressing. And see, that's exactly the point. That's the whole point. That when things were at their darkest, when there literally was no hope, when there was nothing but despair, when the whole world was in rubble and in shambles, when everything had fallen apart in individuals' lives, in a society, when in the words of the New Testament, when darkness reigned, a group of women went to go visit Jesus' tomb to pay respect to their friend who had died a few days before. But when they got there, the tomb was open and there was no body. Jesus wasn't there, but there was someone that was there. This is a painting by Benjamin West called The Angel at the Tomb of Christ. You can see the women there. When they got to the tomb, there was an angel. The word angel in the New Testament literally translates as messenger. That's what angel means. Angel means messenger. There was a messenger, a herald sent from the king to make an announcement. And that announcement is, Jesus is not here because he is risen. And one of those ladies is named Mary Magdalene. And Mary Magdalene will actually have this encounter with Jesus. Like, they will talk. And Mary then will run back to Jesus' other friends and followers, and she'll say, I have seen him. He's alive. And those followers will at first struggle to believe it, because who comes back from the dead? You don't do that. And so they'll kind of struggle with all of this, but eventually they will see Jesus. They will have breakfast with Jesus. They'll talk with Jesus. They will literally touch his wounds. And then that small group begins to spread out all over the entire Roman world. And everywhere they go, they tell people this gospel, this good news, that Jesus died, he resurrected, he ascended, he has become the Christ, and he is king. Because again, that's how news works. One person tells another person, what I received, I passed on to you. And so they go all over the place making this announcement that Jesus has become the Christ, that he is risen. And so even though we live in this world that is just rubble, that is unraveling, even though a lot of our lives, we may look at our lives and think, man, that picture was my life. It's in shambles. It's nothing but rubble. All of it is unraveling. The reason that we celebrate at Easter, the reason that we have joy and peace, even in the midst of the rubble and the unraveling, is because of the gospel, because Jesus has become the Christ, because he died, he endured, he overcame death, he has risen, he has ascended, and he is the king. Paul will actually call Jesus, he will actually refer to Jesus as the first fruits of the new creation. What Paul means is, hey, Jesus is a taste, he's a picture of where all of this is going. That what God is doing through Jesus the Christ is he is making all things new. That's what his kingship is about. That's what his kingdom is about. It's about the renewal of all things. It's about new creation. And Jesus is a taste of that. Jesus is a picture of where everything is going. Yes, we live, most of us, when we think of salvation, we think of hell. That's what we think of. Salvation is about being saved from hell. That's partly true. But when the New Testament talks about hell, the language it uses is pain and suffering and loneliness and isolation and death. Those things are real now. Like, some of us live in those every day. We live in these hells. Hell is an experience that we have now on earth, and it's where all of this is headed. But the good news of the gospel is that Jesus, in becoming king, Paul says, what is he doing? He's saving. He is rescuing his creation from the trajectory that it's on, from where it's going, and he is making all things new. And so on Easter, even in the midst of unraveling lives and in the midst of unraveling worlds, we celebrate, we sing, we rejoice because Jesus has become the Christ. He is the King, and he is making all things new.